Hello and welcome back to Revisiting the Classics. So, Metal Gear Solid. What can be said about it that hasn't been said already? It's one of the defining classics not only of the PlayStation era but of all of gaming. It created the stealth game and is still a massive worldwide phenomena to this day. So how did it come about? Well, the pivotal character in this story is going to be a young man named Hideo Kojima. He would eventually go on to create the Metal Gear series, become vice president of Konami, and be widely considered as one of the great auteurs of gaming. Funnily enough, however, back in 1986 he was considered something of a bad hire by Konami. He couldn't make art and he had very minimal programming knowledge, so he was relegated to being the designer at the Konami branch that was designing games for the MSX computer at the time. This further disappointed him because he had longed to create games for the NES after being inspired to join the industry by Super Mario Bros. So he was an idea man working on a platform he didn't want to work on, whose ideas were being glossed over by his colleagues who considered him useless. Not exactly ideal conditions. He was also being given lower budget shovelware titles like Penguin Adventure, so with the odds stacked against him, it looked as if Kojima was going to be fired, but his bosses at Konami gave him one more chance to prove himself and appointed him as head of his own project. Then a creative spark would be lit in the 24-year-old designer that would change the industry for decades to come. Originally, Konami had wanted him to create a war game, so he started out designing a game inspired by the American action movies he had watched so much in college, like Die Hard and Escape from New York. The only problem was that the MSX lacked the power to render multiple enemies and bullets on screen at once. So Kojima had the idea to center the game around stealthily sneaking through a base rather than gung-ho action. With that simple decision, the stealth genre was born. In fact, to achieve this, Snake starts the game with nothing but a pack of cigarettes and you must scrounge weapons and ammo on sight. This would later become a staple of the series and the genre as a whole. Konami's upper management were not keen on the idea. They wanted to scrap the project. Completely. Fed up with how he was being treated at the company, Kojima considered quitting the industry altogether. But luckily for us, he didn't. Kojima first went to his boss and vented his frustrations. His boss told him not to give up and to compromise, and also gave him some advice on how to deal with the suits. Armed with this advice, Kojima went back to Konami's upper management and convinced them to release the game. With Kojima's innovations in gameplay and his love of film shining through the game's plot, which was probably the most narratively focused title at the time, Metal Gear was released on the MSX in 1987 and became a smash hit. So successful, in fact, that it would get a port to the NES in 1988. However, this version of the game was marred by a number of issues, including a terrible translation, a changed story, no final boss fight with Metal Gear, simplified controls, and more of a focus on action. It was not Kojima's vision, and this was a fact that he was quite vocal about. However, as far as he was concerned, Metal Gear was done, and he had moved on to his next idea, Snatcher, a point-and-click adventure game inspired by cyberpunk films like Blade Runner. In his mind, he had made the game he set out to make and proved his worth to Konami, so it was time to move on to the next big thing. However, Konami liked the numbers that Metal Gear brought in, so they were not so quick to move on. Without Kojima's permission, or even notifying him, they began working on a sequel to the NES version of Metal Gear. So the game went into development and became even less like Kojima's vision. It was a generic run-and-gun shooter with almost no story ties to the original Metal Gear, and Kojima had no knowledge of it. That is, until one day, he and the game's director, Takeshi Fujimoto, happened to sit next to each other on the train. Fujimoto, being a big fan of the original Metal Gear, recognized Kojima and began to strike up a conversation with him. He told him what he was doing with the sequel and encouraged him to develop his own. Spurred on by Fujimoto's encouragement and his disdain for where Konami was taking the series, Kojima began working on his own Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake, for the MSX2, which released in 1990. Expanding on the original game's stealth mechanics and diving deeper into the plot, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is regarded by many fans, including myself, to be one of the finest entries in the series, and it still holds up really well to this day. However, it did not sell well at all. The MSX computer was exclusive to Japan, so Western gamers who had cut their teeth on the first two NES games were not able to play it, and Japanese gamers who were able to play it had mostly upgraded to 16-bit machines like the Super Nintendo. So once again, Kojima considered the series finished and moved on to other games. This time, Police Knots, a story-driven adventure game about space cops. Then in 1994, Sony's PlayStation hit the scene. With the extra space offered by its discs and its impressive internal horsepower, the PlayStation allowed developers to do all kinds of new things, and Konami wanted in on it. Kojima also saw an opportunity to bring the Metal Gear franchise back into the public conscience. With this new Metal Gear, Kojima also set out to redefine what it means to play a video game. Thus, all the stars were aligned for something grand to happen, and in 1998, Metal Gear Solid was released on the PlayStation. The game keeps the top-down view of the original Metal Gear games, but with the characters and environments rendered in 3D, and the graphics are pretty terrible, as all of the early polygon graphics tend to be. It does look better than, say, Final Fantasy VII, and you can generally tell what everything is, so it's passable, but that's about the nicest compliment I can give it. The graphics don't get in the way of the gameplay, however, which is still as fun as ever. It still has the sort of arcade stealth feel of the previous two Metal Gear games, so the focus is on memorizing guard patterns and moving through them quickly. It's extremely fluid and satisfying. It's also difficult enough to be a challenge, but not so difficult that it will alienate players who are new to the genre. The boss fights are also some of the greatest in all of gaming. Each boss is a unique and interesting character, and they all get enough screen time for you to understand and even sympathize with some of them. They all provide tests of different skills and keep things fresh as well. I only have two complaints about the gameplay, the first being backtracking. While the PlayStation discs did offer a lot of space over what was previously available, it was still limited, which means Kojima couldn't fit a whole lot of areas in the game, but he still wanted to pad it out to a 10-hour runtime. So you have to backtrack through a large chunk of the map once and the entirety of the map another time. I honestly wish they would have just let the game be 6 or 8 hours long and cut out the backtracking. I think it would have been a much stronger game for it. My other complaint is how often the gameplay gets interrupted by cutscenes. Kojima's aspirations of being a film director have long manifested themselves in the Metal Gear Solid series in the form of extremely frequent and long-winded cutscenes. While this is the most reined-back entry in the Metal Gear Solid franchise in terms of cutscenes, it still interrupted the gameplay a little too frequently for my taste. The good news is that Kojima is great at creating compelling characters, and he has a ridiculous attention to detail as well, and a good sense of humor. The bad news is that Kojima can't write a coherent plot point to save his life. Most of the major plot points in Metal Gear Solid series are pretty dumb. The major overarching themes of the series are interesting, and I feel that a lot of the way those themes are delivered is really cool and clever, but the moment-to-moment plot is very dumb. Anyone who thinks Hideo Kojima is the greatest writer in video games needs to step back and think about the fact that the major plot twist in Metal Gear Solid 2 is that the giant oil tanker is secretly a giant computer housing AIs that are essentially ghosts of a secret group of men that run the world, and the former president of the United States has a ninja lightning swords fight on the top of the Library of Congress. However, I think Kojima knows the plot is dumb and never takes it too seriously, and the series' sense of humor also made it to where my enjoyment of the plot was never hindered by how dumb it was. The soundtrack for the game is legendary as well, and some of gaming's most well-known sounds were created here, including David Hayter's legendary voice performance as Solid Snake. So, if you haven't played this game, it still holds up really well, so download it on PSN or find an original copy and give it a go.